Well, good morning, everybody. Good to see you. My name is Steve, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm one of the pastors on the team here, and excited to get to hang out with you this morning as we sort of continue the series that we started last week called the Summer on the Mount. And if you were here last week, one of the things that I talked about in my message was I was actually talking about my kids, and I realized afterwards that many of you probably don't even know who my kids are because I'm not really that popular. And so I thought I would take a second and introduce you to my kids this morning, not like live in person, because we all know that would be a disaster, but I thought I'd show you some pictures of my kids and kind of introduce you. And so this first one, this is my daughter. This is Indy. I mean, come on, look at this. Does it get any cuter than this? Okay, I mean, she's doing the duck face that is from 2013, and she gets that from her mom. But no, actually, a lot of people say that she looks just like her dad. So for those of you who oohed and awed, thank you for the compliment. I appreciate that. But once you kind of get over the initial sort of cuteness of the picture, if you're normal, you should be asking like questions like, what is happening here in this picture? Like why is my daughter in my sink? These are the questions that I asked when I saw this picture my wife took. And why is the sink full of like milk or lemons? Like, I don't know what's happening here. I can't really vouch for this, but apparently my wife has been spending a lot of time on Pinterest, and she saw this. And so that's my daughter, Indy, who's like, less than a year. I don't even know how old she is. She's like 10 months maybe, somewhere in that range. So that's Indy. She's awesome. She's our chill child. She's very laid back. She's a baby. She can't really do a whole lot, which is nice. Because we also have my 3-year-old son. This is Davis, okay? Now, Davis, for those of you who know him, he is our crazy one, okay? Like, he is very strong-willed. He's very stubborn. When he gets his mind set on something, like you can't convince him otherwise. He is constantly getting in trouble and constantly arguing. All these traits he picked up from his mom. And so Davis, as you can tell, we love him. We really do. We love him. We don't like him sometimes, but we definitely love him. And as you can tell, Davis loves superheroes, okay? He's kind of in the superhero phase. He watches Batman and Spider-Man and Black Panther. Most days I come home from work and he's got like a suit on or something and he's like, Dad, I want to fight together, which means he wants me to like just slam him on the bed over and over again until he taps out. But Davis is sort of in this superhero deal, and with him kind of being so strong-willed, one of the normal occurrences in our house is that Davis constantly gets in trouble, which means I constantly have to sit him down and try to discipline and try to help him to understand why what he's doing is wrong. And so, a normal conversation where he'll do something bad and he'll kind of be in trouble and he'll be in a bad mood, and you know how kids are. And so I sit him down, I'm like, buddy, that's not kind. Why did you do that? That's not kind. And lately, again, it's funny trying to reason with a 3-year-old. Like, why did you do that? Like, I want you to examine your motives. And clearly he's 3 and he's just ticked off at the world. And so he doesn't really respond. But lately, this has been his response as he's kind of in the superhero phase in his life. Is I'll ask him, buddy, why did you do that? And he'll look up and he'll say, Daddy, because I'm the bad guy. I'm like, okay. And so I'm putting 2 and 2 together. And clearly, he's watching all of these shows. And he sees the bad guy in the shows, which he can clearly identify with, and he sees that the bad guy can kind of do whatever he wants, and there's no rules for the bad guy, and he gets away with it, and so he's like, yeah, I want that, So he's like, I'm the bad guy. Now, I'm trying to be a good dad, and I don't want my kid going through life calling himself the bad guy. I'm pretty sure that's why there's therapy, and so I'm like, dude, I'm like, you're not the bad guy, you're the good guy, you're the good guy, buddy. We help people, we're kind. And he's like, I'm the bad guy. And he just argues. And then after a few minutes, inevitably, this happens all the time, inevitably after a few minutes, when he kind of calms down and he's happy again, he'll come up to me and say, Daddy, I'm a good guy now. Which I'm like, cool, that's awesome. Just please, dear God, stay the good guy because I can't handle this. And so I'm trying to sort of reinforce this idea of dude, you're a good kid, be the good guy. However you want to frame this in your 3-year-old mind. And so this past week we're driving and he's in the back seat, in the car seat, and I'm trying to reinforce this idea. So I look back and I say, buddy, did you know you're Daddy's favorite good guy? I love how good of a good guy you are, whatever. I'm just trying to you're the good guy. And he's kind of pausing for a moment. He's sort of in deep thought for a second. And he looks back and he says, Daddy, I'm the good guy and the bad guy. And I'm like, dude, no, like, you're not getting it. You can't be both. It's one or the other, right? Like, you're the good guy. And he's like, no, I'm the good guy and the bad guy. And of course, he wants to argue with me about it, and he's just stubborn. And so finally, I just throw in the towel, and I'm like, okay, whatever, dude. You're the good guy and the bad guy. Like, you do you, kid. Like, that's fine, And so we got to the place that we were going, and the more that I thought about it as I was thinking about my stubborn child is, you know what? He's kind of right. He sort of is the good guy and the bad guy sometimes. And I think what Davis, my 3-year-old, was pinpointing is this internal struggle that I think all of us feel from time to time. This internal kind of tension that we feel between, we all sort of want to be the good guy, if you will. Like, we all kind of naturally want to do the right thing. Like, that's what we aspire to. But yet, over and over, we find ourselves falling short. And we find ourselves, even though we want to be the good guy, we find ourselves so often sabotaging ourselves and making the kind of choices that we're not only proud of, but the kind of choices that we regret. And why do we do that? Why do we have these aspirations of wanting to kind of be a person of integrity who lives the right kind of way, and yet we find ourselves over and over stumbling and sort of reverting back to the bad habits that we ultimately regret and that end up hurting ourselves? I think what Davis, my son, was talking about that day, I think he sort of pinpointed this existential crisis, this struggle that all of us feel. And see, in this text that we're looking at in this Sermon on the Mount, in this text, Jesus actually addresses this. He actually looks at this. See, because if you missed last week, I'd really encourage you to jump on the app and download the message. You can watch it. You can download the podcast, because we covered a lot of ground last week. But what we're looking at in this series in this series called Sermon on the Mount, is we're looking at Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount. And it's this passage in Matthew chapter 5 through 7 where Jesus gives his most famous sermon, this groundbreaking sermon that ultimately introduces this new way of living that was so powerful that it still reverberates us and it reverberates thousands of years later and invites us today into this new and better way of living. And what we said last week was that we're going to spend this week and last week, and we're going to kind of take a little bit different approach than usual. Because usually what we do here at Icon is we'll take a few weeks and we'll kind of dive into one topic or one idea. But we said what we're going to do is we're going to take these first couple weeks of this series, and we're just going to go verse by verse and do a little bit more expository, if you will, and just kind of let the text goes where the text goes, and just see what did Jesus say, and what did it mean to the people who originally heard it, and then how can we learn from that and apply that. And so last week, we looked at the first few verses of the Beatitudes, which is this kind of series of statements that Jesus made that invites us into this better way of living that apparently God blesses. We learned that last week. And so today, we're going to pick up right where we left off, where Jesus addresses this idea of right living. And this is what it says in verse 6. It says, God blesses those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. We're going to come back to that. For they will be satisfied. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Now, that word righteousness sort of invokes this picture of right living, of sort of embodying justice and integrity and being consistent and making the kind of choices that you're proud of. It's this right way of living. If I was translating this verse for my son, I would probably say it something like this: God blesses those who hunger and thirst for maybe being the good guy, right? Because that internal tension and that struggle that we all feel, this is what they're talking about. This is at the crux of it, of saying, listen, I know that I should do these things, but I find myself so often falling short. Jesus is addressing this firsthand. And see, he invites us into this better way of living. He says, here's when my blessing follows you, when you hunger and thirst. When you hunger and thirst. Now, I think Jesus used this language very intentionally. Because I think he used it on purpose for two really specific reasons. And the first reason is this, is Jesus actually uses this picture of hunger because our physical appetite, right, is something that is never fully or finally satisfied, and so it is in our relationship with God. As we pursue Jesus, it's the same. In the same way that we don't, when we're hungry We don't check some box and eat some meal one time and say, okay, we did that. We ate our meal. Now we're good. We never have to eat again. We never have to, we're just golden. We're there. We're no. Because our physical appetite is something that's never finally satisfied. It's something you have to constantly and continually be mindful of and constantly be feeding yourself in order to stay healthy. And Jesus, in this verse, what's he getting at? He's saying, listen, so it is in your pursuit of him. It's not this one-time thing. It's not you come to church one time and you're good and you check the spiritual box of your life and everything's great. It's not some magical prayer that you pray and you're like, okay, me and God are great and so I can just do whatever. No, he's saying, listen, this relationship with me is a lifelong journey. This pursuit of being more like me is something that you must continually and constantly invest in, and when you do, you'll be blessed. You have to treat it like an appetite. He says, I want you to hunger and thirst. Now, the other reason I think Jesus used this language is because he was speaking to a group of people in the first century who knew on a very personal and tangible level what it meant to hunger and thirst. Because in the first century, I think they dealt with hunger and thirst in a way that, quite frankly, most of us just can't really identify with all that much because we live in this modern world where we turn a knob and there's an unlimited supply of clean, cool water that comes out. And this obviously was not the case in the ancient world. Food insecurity and even famine was not an uncommon phenomenon. And so Jesus is looking at a group of people who understood on a very personal and tangible level what it meant to hunger, to truly hunger, to be starving, to thirst. And he's looking at those people and he's saying, that same desperation that you have for your food, that same level of desire that you have for water, I want you to approach me with that same level of desire and desperation. And when you do, you will be satisfied because I will bless you. Now, if you missed last week, one of the things that we unpacked was that word blessing that Jesus uses over and over again in this passage. He's not talking about a material blessing. He's not saying, hey, if you do this, I'm going to give you money or I'm going to give you this. He's saying, no. That word blessing, what that's getting at is he's saying, listen, I will be with you. I'm on your side. You're not alone. What he's saying in this verse is when you hunger and you thirst for righteousness, for his way of living, he's saying, I'm going to help you get there. I love the way that the Passion Translation says this verse here. It says this, how enriched you are when you crave righteousness, for you will be surrounded with fruitfulness. You could take that word fruitfulness and replace it with results, right? To kind of put it in our language here a little bit more. In other words, if you want results in your life, if you want to see results in your spiritual life, if you want to move forward, what do? You hunger and thirst and crave righteousness. Which begs the question that I kept coming back to over and over this week as I was thinking about this is, what do you do when you don't crave righteousness? Like, it's not that you're anti-God or anti-Jesus and you're like, no, I don't want anything to do with that. It's not that. I mean, clearly none of us here would say that, right? You're here. You're at church. But what do you do when it's like, man, just being honest, like, I just don't really think about this stuff all that much. You talk about hungering and the same desire that I have for food. I really love food. I don't really think about God like that, Like, how do you develop a desire when you don't have a real desire? Because Jesus promises when you hunger and you thirst and when you desire me, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to help you get there. You're going to see results in your life. Well, what do you do when you don't have that desire? How do you develop that? And I kept thinking about that this week, and the more that I thought about it, the best way that I could kind of think to put it as I thought about my own spiritual kind of faith journey is I think developing a desire for God is a lot like drinking coffee, okay? Stay with me, okay? Why? Because it's an acquired taste. You say, what do you mean? Well, I remember when I was first introduced to coffee when I was in college, the very first time that I had coffee, I hated it, okay? I thought it was terrible. It was bitter. It didn't taste good. It looked like tar. I hated it. I didn't want anything to do with it. I tried it, and I was like, this is terrible. But I did like the results from the coffee, right? I like that little caffeine boost that it gave me when I was studying. And so even though I didn't like the thing, I sure kind of liked the results of that. I'm like, man, okay. And so what did I do? Well, I started going to Starbucks and ordering like a Frappuccino, which is basically like a milkshake with like a hint of coffee. Like there's no coffee in it at all, right? And I started drinking those because I could kind of tolerate that, you know? And then over time, I started to order more like, you know, vanilla lattes and things like that. And I started to, over time, started to acquire a taste for coffee. I started out not even being able to tolerate coffee, just hating it. And then the more that I drank it, the more that I became, accustomed to it. It went from barely being able to tolerate it to actually kind of liking it to now I literally crave coffee every single day. I mean, not a morning goes by that I don't drink black coffee, and usually it's like 2 and 3 and 4 cups, which again, I know is a personal problem, but please stop judging me, okay? I feel the judgment. And see, the same is true, I think, in our relationship with God. The more that we pursue Him, the more that over time you begin to acquire a taste and a hunger and thirst for Him. You see, over time, doing the right things begins to produce the right kind of desires in your life. You say, I don't really have a desire. I don't really think about God. You know where you could start is you just start somewhere. You just start trying to pursue God more. You start trying to be more consistent. Maybe for you, it's saying, man, I just want to start being more consistent coming to church. You know, I come once a month, or whenever I think about it, whenever I feel guilty about something, I come to church to try to make it up with me and God. You know, you're like, that's your church experience. Maybe for you, you say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to try to prioritize coming here because I don't know how I feel about all this stuff. I'm not sure what I think about all those songs they sing, but there's something about it that I'm kind of drawn to, and so I want to be more like Jesus. I want to try to, embrace His way of living, so I just want to be around that more. And what will happen is the more that you put yourself in environments like that, over time, you start to acquire a taste. Over time, you start to develop a desire. Maybe for you, it's saying, I hear him talk about this scripture stuff all the time, but I've never one time opened a Bible myself and actually tried to read it. I'm just going to try to start reading the scriptures. And over time, at the beginning, it may feel kind of foreign. At the beginning, it may feel like, man, this stuff, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't really like this in the same way that I didn't like coffee at the beginning. But over time, you start to develop these desires. And God says that as you hunger and thirst for Him, He will satisfy you. He will help you grow, and you will be blessed. And so Jesus switches gears, and He continues in the next verse, and He says this. He says, God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. He blesses those who are merciful, for they'll be shown mercy. Now, given what we've learned about the political landscape of that day and the economic hardships that many of the people in Jesus' audience would have dealt with in a really practical way, that many of them had much injustice in their life that came in large part due to Roman oppression that they lived under, this would have been a really difficult pill to swallow when Jesus talks about mercy. Because you have to remember, this is a group of people who many of them had been taken advantage of. Many of them had experienced physical injustice and prejudice against them. They had been victims of injustice. They weren't dealt a fair hand of cards. And Jesus has the audacity that day to look at them and says, hey, you guys, I want you to extend mercy. That was the last thing they wanted to do. Now, to really understand what Jesus is saying here, I want to unpack a couple words here that I think will help us. It's this distinction between mercy and grace. Because I think oftentimes we think of these words in the same sort of context, but there's actually a really important distinction that will help us understand what Jesus is getting at. You may have heard this before, but grace is getting something that you don't deserve, right? So like in that last verse we just looked at, Jesus is actually extending grace because He's saying, hey, if you hunger and you thirst after me, I'm going to help you get there. I'm going to help you grow. I'm going to help you get results in your life. And what's happening? Jesus is actually extending grace. We didn't do anything to earn that. We didn't do anything to deserve that. He just says, I want to give you this free gift. I'm going to help you. I'm with you. It's grace. But mercy, on the other hand, is this. It's not getting what you do deserve. It's not getting something that you do deserve. It's a small distinction, but it's really important. Because if you're there that day and you're Jewish and you're under Roman oppression, you're looking at the Romans and you're thinking, man, these guys deserve to die. because they stole my freedom. They've oppressed my family. They took my land. That's what they deserve. And yet Jesus looks at those people and he says, I want you to extend mercy. Now, I want you to catch the implication of what Jesus is getting at. Okay, you got to catch it. It's easy to breeze by, but think about it. If you've ever been in a position when you need mercy, maybe for you, you had this moment where you missed a bill payment. Maybe you had a mortgage payment due, and you missed the mortgage payment. You just forgot about it, or maybe just finances were so tight and you couldn't afford it. Well, what happens? Well, there's penalties and there's interest, and all of a sudden it starts costing you money, and you're looking at this, and what do? You can't afford it, so you call the mortgage company. And you say, hey, listen, is there any way you can cut me a break? Here's what happened. I couldn't afford it. I just forgot. Is there any way you can help me? What are you doing? You're asking for mercy, right? You're saying, hey, don't give me the thing that I do deserve, right? I know I signed this contract, and it said if I missed a payment, then I had to pay this penalty fee, but I'm asking you, would you give me mercy? Who in this situation, here's what's interesting, who in this situation holds the power? Well, it's the mortgage company, right? They hold the power to either extend mercy or not. You are quite literally, as the expression goes, at the mercy of your mortgage company. And see, here's what's true of mercy, is mercy can only be extended from a position of power. Now, this is a really important implication that Jesus is getting at in this verse here, because you have to understand, what is Jesus saying to this group of people who have experienced firsthand so much injustice and so much pain in their lives? What is he saying to them? He's saying, guys, it's time for you to take back the power of your own life. He's saying, listen, stop with the victim mentality. He's saying, enough with feeling sorry for yourself and allowing those negative things in your life to define you. You don't have to live like that anymore, because when you begin to extend mercy, you begin to take back control over your own life. Because listen, there's a lot of things in life that you can't control. You can't control your circumstances. You can't control some of the injustices and the wrong that has happened to some of us in the room, and that certainly happened to them that was in Jesus' audience that day. But he looks at those people and he says, here's what you can control. You can control your response. You can control your emotions. You can control your attitude. You have the ability to stand up and extend mercy. He's introducing a new approach to life, and he's saying, listen, forgiveness is the way forward. Stop giving those people who hurt you and wronged you control over your life for far too long. You've thought too low of yourself. Jesus would look at you and say, listen, there's a better way, and it starts with extending mercy and extending forgiveness. And when you do, you can find freedom. And when you do, you can find reconciliation in relationships. And God can actually begin to bring healing in your life when you embrace mercy. And so he continues on again, changes the subject again. And this is what he says in the next verse, verse 8. He said, God blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God. Now, I don't know about you, but there have been many times in my life when I have prayed and begged to see God, where I'm like, maybe you've had a big decision, you're at this crossroads in life, and you're trying to figure out, do I go left or right? And so you're praying, you're saying, God, what do I do? Just show me, help me see you. I remember when I was graduating, I think high school, and I had all these people asking me, so what are you going to do with your life? And I remember thinking, I have no idea what I'm going to do with my life. I don't know why we put pressure on 18-year-olds to know what they're going to do with their whole life, but that's another story. And so I remember begging God and saying, God, just show me what you want me to do. I don't know what college, I don't know what career, I don't know anything. I'm 17. God, just help me, and just begging God. I'll do whatever you want. Just show me. Just tell me. Just give me clarity. Help me to see you. You see, I think all of us want to see God. We want to hear God. We want to know God. And in this passage, Jesus gives us the secret to seeing God. Now, again, we're going to circle back around to this, but it's important to understand the context of the original audience that day, because if you were Jewish in this audience, this would have been a very foreign concept on how you learned to relate to God. This would have been very counterintuitive because for someone who is Jewish, a pure heart was not your primary motivation. That wasn't something that got you up in the morning. That wasn't what you really cared about because you lived in a world and you grew up with all sorts of laws. There was, in fact, 613 laws, plus there was all these rabbinical kind of system of laws on top of that were to help you kind of achieve this sort of external purity, to be ceremonially clean. And yet the reality is that it was possible to observe every single law, observe every single, pharisaical law on top of the laws and the system of here's how you do every little thing down to the T, and yet still bypass the most important thing of all, purity of the heart. In fact, this is what we see in the New Testament. Jesus, he rebuked the Pharisees over and over again for this. He said, guys, you're doing the right things. You're following the laws to a T, but you're missing it. You're missing it. Why? Because your hearts are far from me. Jesus looks at them and says, listen, it's all about the heart. A pure heart is what produces external purity, not the other way around. In other words, you can't do enough right things to just fix your heart. You've got to start with the heart, and everything flows out of that. You got to get your internal world right. I love how the Passion Version puts this verse. It says it like this. It says, you're blessed when you get your inside world, your mind and your heart put right. For then, and only then, can you see God in your outside world. It's all about your heart. You say, I want to see God. I want clarity around this decision. What do? Get your heart right. You say, man, I want to be more in step and in tune and in rhythm with God. I feel like he's so far away. Where do I start? It starts with your heart. And so the question is how do we take a step towards being more pure in heart? What does that look like? I think a good place to start, in fact, this is so basic and so elementary that I almost didn't put this in, but I kept coming back to it because I feel like this is really the beginning of a pursuit of a pure heart as we pursue after Jesus. Here's the first thing you need to do is you just got to pray and ask God and say, God, would you give me a pure heart? Would you help me to pursue you with pure motives, not to get something, not so that I can get something in return, but God, help me to develop a heart that is truly pure. God, would you reveal to me the blind spots in my life that even I'm blind to? Would you show me the stuff internally in my thoughts and in my heart that isn't pleasing to you? Would you help me to fix that? God, would you give me a new heart? These are powerful, powerful prayers, and here's why. Because these are prayers that Jesus loves to answer. When we begin to shift our focus from trying to do the right things and having the ledger where it's like, well, I guess if I do more good things than I do bad things, then maybe me and God are good. God says, man, you're missing it. See, what I've learned over and over again is this, is that God is so much more concerned with our pursuit than our perfection. And he says, man, when you start to seek me, when you start to get your heart right, you will see me all around you because I will help you get there. And so Jesus looks at you and says, man, it's time to get our internal world right because when we do, then we begin to see Jesus at work all around us and we can join with him in that because we are blessed. And he continues on with one last verse that we're going to look at here. It's verse 9. He says this. He said, God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called children of God. God blesses those who work for peace. Now, again, at the risk of sounding repetitive, I want to look at the original audience that day. This would have been a very difficult thing to hear because this was not something you wanted Jesus to talk about, peace. Because remember, what we learned last week is this was an incredibly diverse audience. I mean, there were people there that had very, very different worldviews. And you were sitting next to people that you adamantly disagreed with, that you thought these people are wrong and they're unclean, and there would have been a palpable tension in the room just between the people sitting next to each other. And what you didn't want to look at that person. You didn't care about peace. You wanted to show them that you were right and they were wrong. You ever been there before? That's what you wanted. And then to add another layer of complexity on it, like we've talked about, this was a group of people who was there, that those that were Jewish, that lived under Roman oppression, that had their freedoms and their livelihoods, many of them taken away. And they look at Jesus and they've been waiting for a Messiah that was going to come and set them free and give them their land back. And what we learned last week is that Messiah, they expected him to rise to military might. In other words, he was going to start this army and take over and fight back and fight the government and take back their land, and that's what they wanted. They didn't want peace, they wanted justice. And Jesus looks at them and he says, hey, here's who's blessed. It's the peacemakers. I mean, this would have been incredibly deflating. But yet Jesus says, this is where my blessing follows. And so it begs the question is, what does it look like for us to be a peacemaker? What is that? Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge when we talk about being a peacemaker is it looks like a lot of work, okay? Like Jesus, he said it himself. He said, God blesses those who what? Who work for peace. The implication being this is not something that comes naturally for most of us. This is not something that is easy for most of us. This is something that's incredibly difficult because peacemaking by its very nature elevates others over your personal preferences. And I don't know about you, but I really like my personal preferences, you know? Like, I don't want to work and set that aside for the sake of peacemaking, but yet Jesus says we must join in the work of peacemaking. So what does that look like? I want to give you a couple ideas here on what this peacemaking looks like for us. Number one, peacemakers, they choose to believe the best about others. They choose to believe the best in others. In other words, when someone does something that you don't understand or that you don't like or that you even disagree with, peacemaking looks like choosing to believe the most generous version of the story. In other words, when you're at work and your coworker drops the ball on this assignment and all of a sudden it creates work for the whole department and everyone's upset, instead of telling yourself the story that, yeah, you know, this guy is just so lazy and he doesn't care about anybody and now we all have to pick up the slack, you choose to believe the most generous version of the story. I'm not talking about being naive. I'm talking about giving people the benefit of the doubt. So you look at that person and say, man, I know they wouldn't have done that on purpose. Maybe they've got stuff going on at home. Maybe they didn't understand the assignment. Instead of like pointing the finger and getting mad, you look at that person and say, man, how can I help you? That's peacemaking. Peacemaking says, man, I'm gonna make an allowance for others. I'm gonna create space for people's mistakes. This is what it means to be a peacemaker. It says, how can I help? What can I do to be a part of the solution? I choose to believe the best in others. What else? Peacemakers seek to bring people together. I mean, Jesus was the master of this, at bringing people together. I mean, he had an incredibly diverse group of people that never would have been in the same room together, but he brought them together. Why? Because people who weren't like Jesus liked Jesus. And the question I would pose to you today is the same true of you? Are people who aren't like you friends with you? Are you able to engage with people who you disagree with? Are you able to actually have a conversation with someone that has a different political or religious or moral perspective than what you do? Are you able to actually listen to them, not with the intent to try to prove them wrong and show how right you are, but to actually understand them? That's peacemaking. It's bringing people together, because if we are not careful, what we often do is we end up talking a lot about people instead of actually talking with people. And the more that we only talk about people, the more that rips people apart and creates division. But peacemaking brings people together. Peacemaking says, I may not agree with everything that you say and do, but I can still love and honor and celebrate you as a person. That's peacemaking. And finally, peacemakers seek to improve the situation. They seek to improve the situation. They don't walk by a problem and complain and critique about how bad things are and say, man, somebody should do something about that. No. Peacemakers roll up their sleeves and they get to work on making it better. They don't walk into a room and say, oh, man, this is terrible. No, they say, how can I improve the situation? Are you the kind of person who, when you walk into a room, you make that room better? Because that's what it looks like to be someone who brings peace. Are you the kind of person, when you see something broken, do you keep going or do you stop and say, how can I help be a part of the solution? How can I fix it? Are you the kind of person who, there's work gossip and you're talking about such and such? Are you the kind of person who enters into that and joins the conversation and laughs? Or are you the kind of person that's a voice of reason and reconciliation? This is what it means to be a peacemaker. It's saying, what part can I play in bringing peace? And Jesus loves when we join him in this kingdom-building work because this is so central to the heart of God. It's why he sent his son Jesus in the first place, so that he could bring what? Peace and reconciliation, so that he could give us peace with God, so that he could restore things to the way that they were supposed to be all along. And when we join in with him in this work, he says that we are blessed. And see, this morning, as we bring this kind of whole thing to a close, I just want to remind you that I think this life that Jesus introduces us to at this first part of his sermon, this new way of living, I think this is something that's worth fighting for. I think it's something that's worth striving for, to try to embody some of what Jesus is talking about, because he tells us that we live our most vibrant, our most fulfilled lives when we embrace his way of living. When we embrace this way of living that not only makes our lives better, but it makes the whole world better. There's something about that that's powerful that I don't know about you, but I want to join into that. And so this morning, as we go out this week, my challenge for you is simply this, is that we would put some of this into practice. That we would intentionally be the kind of people who bring peace in every environment that we're in. We engage with people that are different than us. We try to bring solutions at work. That we would take the time and do the work to get our internal world right so that we can see God at work all around us and engage with him in that. That we would decide that, you know what? We're going to take back control of our lives. We're not going to let the wrong that was done to us, the hurt and the pain that we felt define us anymore, but rather we're going to choose to extend mercy and to forgive and allow God to bring restoration and healing in our lives and the lives of others. And that we would be passionate in our pursuit of Jesus. And we would say, God, help us to develop a desire and a heart for you. And when we do that, we begin to enter into this new and better way of living, and it has the power to transform your life and the lives around us. And so this week, may we embrace that. And when we do, God looks at us. God looks at you and he says, you are blessed because he's with you. So let's do that this week. Let me pray for you, and then we're going to continue on.